When you think of the 8-bit era of gaming, industry giants like Nintendo, Capcom, and Konami, along with lesser-known, yet quality publishers and developers Sunsoft, Technos, and Big Tokai spring to mind, accompanied by franchises such as Castlevania, Mega Man, and Double Dragon. In the wake of the retro revival of the late 2000s, these treasured staples of youth have ascended in status to an almost canonical level. On the other end of the spectrum, the crappy games of our childhood, and those who made them, have now become vilified and had a spot reserved for them in the lowest rungs of gaming hell, thanks mostly in part to the angry video game nerd. One company that has received the brunt of his rage more than any other is the toy manufacturer LJN. The nerd's hatred of LJN has now become a running theme throughout his videos, and with each getting millions of views by people of all ages across the globe, the rainbow-identified corporation has been made out to be as vile as Hitler, in some cases blindly proclaimed by those who have never actually played these titles. As for myself, I'm a huge fan of James. I wouldn't be doing this right now if it wasn't for him. I've seen all of those videos tons of times, and I go back to them to this day. But seeing Wolverine and Terminator 2 after all these years had a different effect on me than everyone else. It made me want to play them again. I owned Wolverine and rented T2 as a kid, and I liked them back then. I had similar experiences with Jaws and X-Men, neither of which I remembered as being the turds they were made out to be. AVGN was the catalyst that reignited my love for the NES, Genesis, etc., and the first carts that I purchased when I bought my modded top loader weren't the Marios, Metroid, or other masterpieces, but Bart vs. the Space Mutants, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Dick Tracy, and other duds. Admittedly, the fact that they were dirt cheap was part of the reason, but it was mainly because I wanted to replay those stinkers featured on the AVGN. Fast forward to the present, and I own pretty much every game released for the NES, and have played all of those horrible abominations, and my viewpoint hasn't changed. I try to find the best and even the worst things, and that's just what I'm gonna do right now. In spite of all their flaws, I enjoy most of the LJN library, so I've taken the unenviable task upon myself to don the moniker of the LJN Defender! Sticking up for LJN. This is gonna be tough. So what better way to start off than with perhaps the most despised LJN release based on a licensed title, Back to the Future. Before I get into the thick of things, I want to address what I believe to be a widespread misconception. LJN never developed a single title. They were only a publisher. For example, Back to the Future was developed by Beam Software, who was also responsible for Star Wars, Smash TV, and Fisher-Price I Can Remember. LJN may have still put out a subpar product, but keep in mind that they don't deserve all of the blame, and a few of the guilty by association designers are beyond mind-blowing, but I'll get to that in a future installment. Back to the Future. The Michael J. Fox starring Gem was released in 1985. This piece of pyrite was released in 1989, the same year that production on the sequels took place. In this, you play as Marty, collecting clocks, avoiding hula hoop girls and bees, yada yada yada. It's been stated countless times before that this has very little to do with the plot of the movie. That is true, but very few video games based on film strictly adhere to the source material, and some of the changes made were for the better. Most memorably, Sly snowboarding on a dead guy in Cliffhanger, and Arnold in hot pink pants riding a scorpion in Predator. Think of them as the cherry on the salt pie. Besides, there are levels involving key scenes at the school and the dance, and the DeLorean makes an appearance at the conclusion, but I don't have any footage of that to show, for a reason I'll get to shortly. But for now, let's get back to the main level setup. Black Vest Marty, can't stop, always on the move. I have minimal fault with these sections. They're pretty fun, and the controls are tight. B button for jumping aside. It may be monotonous, but no more so than Paperboy. Paperboy is actually a good comparison, in that the main characters in both are in constant forward momentum and have to get from point A to point B while avoiding hazards of all kinds. Sure, Back to the Future is a little cheaper than the Atari Arcade Classic, but it just adds to the challenge. An extra challenge is always a welcome addition. How can you hate a game that lets you toss bowling balls while riding a skateboard? It could be said that Back to the Future paved the way for the extreme 90s. Nobody's going to, but a case could be made for it. Anyway, if there's any aspect of the stage that I'd have to claim as a negative, it would probably have to be the music. That's going to be difficult to defend. The nerd claimed he'd rather have a buffalo defecate in his ear than listen to this track again, but I can tolerate it to an extent. The biggest problem with the soundtrack is that it's not a soundtrack, but one song repeating over and over, looping from now until the end of eternity. However, there is a very simple solution to this musical malady. Mute the TV and grab your audio device of choice and make your favorite band the soundtrack. Or do what I do and catch up on the week's podcasts. You could even replace the score with superior chiptunes. Imagine! That makes it a little better, doesn't it? Bearing through the oral assault will lead to my biggest hurdle, Lou's Cafe, where Marty has to hurl milkshakes at 50 or more of the approaching bullies in order to continue on with his mission. I appreciate the idea of this level, but I wish it had been executed better. Marty has to be moved up and down behind the counter in order to line up a shot to send Biff and his cronies flying. This sounds simple, but the opposite couldn't be truer. Due to the layout of the level, it's hard to determine if Marty's malts are going to connect or not. If only it had been a first-person perspective, that would make it so much easier. Instead, I spent 2 hours trying to get past this, with each failure resulting in having to go back to the preceding street scene for another stab at Lou's, only to lose time and again. This I cannot and will not defend. Everything James or any other reviewer has said about this stage is true. It is very unforgiving and made even more tedious by having to repeat a level that's already been beaten. As you can see, that's about all I can say about Back to the Future, since that's as far as I've gotten to date. Most of the levels are of the Paperboy walking variety, and being that they don't change up that much, I feel I've played most of the game. Still, I'm determined to complete it someday, so that shows what I think about this much maligned LJN tie-in title. It's not good, but I don't think it's bad. In fact, a few months ago I bought a Back to the Future t-shirt at my local mall, and the first thing I thought of when I saw it wasn't Christopher Lloyd or Robert Zemeckis, but this NES bowel movement. I dig it. And I bet even after I beat it someday, I'll still come back to it now and again. It may have very little to do with the movies, but the concept certainly is creative. Skateboard bowling while fending off bee stings and Macho Men? Who thinks of these things? And what substances were they on? There we have it. LJN Defender Episode 1 in the books. I hope you liked it. I'm interested to see what your reactions will be. I've always wanted to do something involving LJN, but I didn't want to do a full-on review, so this is the best outlet. The purpose of the series isn't to convince you that LJN is unfairly abused or that these titles are great. I know that most of these games are mediocre or worse, but they played a role in getting me back into retro gaming, so that makes me fond of them and their quirks. If I get people to put aside their bias and reassess LJN in their 8-bit offerings, that's awesome. If they do and they still think the games suck, that's fine. This is just a fun idea that I had, and I'm looking forward to making more of them. Whether I defend all of the LJN NES titles remains to be seen, but it is a possibility. I may even cross into the Super Nintendo and Genesis LJN releases that I own, which isn't many. Who knows what the future might bring? I'm sorry. That was terrible. I need to make up for that with something terrific. Oh, I know. For those of you completely unfamiliar with me prior to this video, this is actually my second series. My original show is called Cygnus Destroyer's Retro Reviews. I started it a little over a year ago now, actually. I just put out my 1-year anniversary video on Tiny Toon Adventures games. My first video was on Bucky O'Hare for the NES, my favorite release for that console. Classic Konami quality through and through. And since then, I've covered a bunch of games that were childhood favorites of mine. But I also cover Vigilante for the Sega Master System, Tonic Trouble for the Nintendo 64. I've done a few Sega CD games, like the point-and-click adventure games, Adventures of Willy Beamish, and Secret of Monkey Island. It's all good stuff. It's all enjoyable. Those are actual full-on reviews. What you're going to see in this show might edge into review territory for some of the more unknown games. Like if I do Gotcha, a game like that, which is known to a number of the retro gaming community, but not everybody. Not like the stuff that James has covered. So those might be more reviews, but if you want to see me actually do full-on reviews, check out Cygnus Destroyer's Retro Reviews if you haven't before. There's lots of good stuff there. I'm on the social networks like everybody else. Well, most everybody else. You can find me on Twitter at Cygnus Destroyer. And actually now I have a Facebook page for the show. I finally caved in and joined Facebook. Just for the show, though. I can be found at facebook.com/Cygnus Destroyer. So, yeah. Tune in next time for more defending of the LJNs. Same LJN Defender time and same LJN Defender channel.